This is
Say what?
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod,
RedPubPod.
a podcast
RedPubPod. That's kind of a tongue twister.
Yes, that's why we like.
from Redhawk Publications.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening out there in podcast land, and welcome to RedPubPod, coming to you live from the plush welded studios of Catawba Valley Community College in Hickory, North Carolina, and Redhawk Publications. We're here with Patty Thompson. We're here with Richard Eller, and today we're here with Beth Copeland, who I'm going to turn it over to Patty and let her introduce our special guest.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. And
You're welcome.
Richard, of course, for all of your skills. Beth, it's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
Just so that you guys know, and everyone out there in podcast land, this is April, and it is National Poetry Month. And if you get a chance to check out our Facebook page, you'll see every single day I've been very dedicated about posting a poem of the month. And Beth, you were up on one of our most recent days and certainly got a lot of response. But it makes sense. Your newest book that we've been blessed to publish, Shibori Blue, 36 Views of the Peak, has been really selling quite well. Congratulations.
Thank you. That's good to hear.
Yeah. You've got a lot of folks that are very interested in what you do, but I have a feeling it has a lot to do with your background, which I'm going to do in a proper intro right now, because you have fascinated me from the first time I ever got an email from you. Everyone's background, I'm sure, inspires what they write and the poems that they write. And you were raised kind of all over the place. You were born in Japan.
Yes.
And you traveled throughout India. And of course, now you're in North Carolina. But I sense a military connection here.
Actually, it's a missionary connection. Yeah, my parents were missionaries in Japan, and I was born there. And they went to Japan with my two older sisters in the late 40s. And as you can imagine, that was a pretty brave thing for them to do so soon after World War II. But it was a wonderful place to live. There was never any animosity towards us. And children are very much nurtured in Japan. So it was a very good experience.
Well, I can tell you right now, I think that being there, again, during occupied Japan, that had to be a very interesting point of history, and also being there as an American and as a child of a missionary. So that's wonderful. And you lived in India as well?
We lived in India when I was in the 7th grade. By that time, my father was teaching at Southeastern Baptist Seminary in Wake Forest, which is where I spent most of my childhood. But he had a Fulbright to study as a visiting scholar. His field was comparative religion. And so we lived in Varanasi, which is the city on the Ganges that is the holy city to the Hindus. It's where people go to die because they believe that if they are cremated and their ashes go into the Ganges, that they can escape the cycle of rebirth and go straight to the afterlife. So it was kind of a strange place to be as a 12-year-old girl going on 13. And I didn't always appreciate, the unique opportunity that I'd been given, because I missed my friends, and as you can imagine, but it was really...
And then really the only opportunity you had for new friends were people who were coming to die.
Well,
So, Mom, there's a man coming across the yard. And
we would hear people chanting as they were carrying the dead bodies, to the burning ghats. But I did have some connection with girls my age. My older sister and I went to a girls' school where we only went one day a week, I think, and we took an art class because that was something we could do without speaking the language. But in both Japan and India, I think the hard thing was that as outsiders, we received so much attention that it was kind of unnerving at times,
And I'm just curious, by the way, I've been to Varanasi, so you might have seen a little PTSD on my face.
I did.
That's kind of crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an unusual place.
Very.
your education as you would travel to these different countries? And I understand that you did spend time in Carolinas because your dad was here, but how did you pick up your education in other countries, like in India, for that full year? Was it an American school, an international school?
In India, my two older sisters had a correspondence course that they took. I think it was from the University of Wisconsin, provided that for them. Since I was in junior high, I really just took my books, and it was up to me to. My mother kind of lost patience with me after a while because I didn't like having my mother as my teacher. Um, so I read a lot, but my math skills are terrible, as a result of that, because, I didn't really study math or science.
Well, yeah, if I'm 12 or 13 and you were homeschooled before homeschooling was a thing. So I get it. It's like, yeah, well, those are the classes I think I can spend more time on later. So I can appreciate that. How long have you lived in North Carolina now?
I lived in the Midwest in Chicago for about 26 years, and I went to grad school in Bowling Green, Ohio. But then I came back. So I've been in North Carolina, for I'd say a third of my life at least, and I love it here.
I noticed that you taught in Fayetteville or
Yes, I taught
Southeast Methodist?
Methodist University. Yeah, I taught there for about 10 years.
Okay. So you do have some Eastern, you like the Eastern style barbecue? Is that what I was trying
I
to say?
do. I do like the vinegar style. Yeah.
Now
You better watch out. It's the first controversial thing that's ever been uttered on a Red Pub podcast. It's going to start all kinds of wars and battles and boycotts the program.
that'll be your next poetry session, writing poems on the Eastern versus Western style barbecue. When did you start writing?
When I was, the year I lived in India, I wrote a lot. I had a journal, and I just was pretty isolated, didn't really, as a young woman, you couldn't just go out by yourself. You had to have a chaperone in that culture. And so I didn't really have friends my age, and spent most of my time with my family. So I did a lot of writing. And I think poetry, I think I wrote my first poem where I really felt like the hairs on my neck were standing up. That was when I was, I believe, a sophomore in high school.
Wow, okay. And were you an English lit major or creative writing major?
I was an English major. I went to St. Andrews University in Laurinburg. And I went there because there was a poet in residence, and I knew that I wanted to study poetry. And his name was Ron Bays, and he was a wonderful professor because he was just very nurturing. And I think at that age, if I'd had a professor who was real critical of my writing, I might have been intimidated and just given up. But he really encouraged me. And from there, I went on to graduate school.
It was a creative writing degree?
Yeah, it was an MFA in creative writing.
In terms of your career, were you always writing? Did you have a day gig? Did you have a job in addition to writing on the side?
Oh, I've always had a day gig. I mean, you can't live as a poet unless you're independently wealthy. And I did a number of different jobs. I worked for nonprofit organizations and, did teaching at the college level. And, sometimes I was a bartender even, when I couldn't find a better job. So I've done a lot of
Bars are
different
great
work.
places to find inspiration for stories and poems. 'Cause
Oh, absolutely.
lots of stories around the bar there.
It's an education in itself.
Yep.
And that said, you were collecting your poems, I presume, during your entire life. But at what point did you say, I'm ready to start publishing? And it might have been in journals too, but what point did you start sending out your work?
I started sending it out when I was in college. That was one thing that Ron encouraged me to do. And he said, start at the top, So I was sending poetry to the New Yorker and places like that where I really, had no chance of getting published there. But I did get published in a few literary magazines and continued that when I was older.
And when your very first book that you published, your collection, what was that process like? And did you get accepted by millions of publishers? We want to know the horror stories,
Oh.
the good, the bad, the ugly.
Well, I was very fortunate that my first book was published when I was in college. It was, there was a competition at St. Andrews. At that time, it was a school that was just really, really supportive of writers. And it was for seniors for a chapbook competition. So I was one of 2 people who got their little chapbooks published that year. And, I didn't realize at the time how unusual that was. And also at that college, there were poetry readings every single week. And we had some fairly well-known poets who came through and read there, but I just figured it was that way everywhere. I didn't realize how unusual it was.
And if I'm not mistaken, St. Andrews had a publishing press at the
Yes,
time.
yes.
Isn't St. Andrews where brothers and sisters?
Yeah, like us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it was done.
Yeah. So we took over a book because St. Andrews Press, I don't believe, is around anymore.
I'm not sure what
Yeah.
they're doing. They have new leadership now and things are changing.
But it seems to me that must be a university that really does nurture writing and appreciate it to the extent that they had a press. That impresses me.
Or
Yeah.
it did.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't tell today in today's climate,
Yeah. And when you were teaching, of course, you taught creative writing and
Well,
poetry.
I
or-
taught English composition more.
Okay.
It's very hard to get those plum positions, and it's really competitive.
Oh, tell me about it. The only way I can sneak poetry into my English composition is when I mention a Emily Dickinson poem every once in a while, and I'll read it to them or something like that.
I just had Adrian Rice in my office the other day. We were chatting about poetry, and he was telling me about his creative writing classes and poetry classes, and he told me something that was kind of surprising, but he asked his freshman students who their favorite American living poet is, and there were no hands raised. None of his students knew a living American poet. And I even said, not even Amanda Gorm, everybody knows at least who she is. He's like, nope, nobody knew one. And long story short, he even spoke to some faculty members that also didn't know, and it was kind of surprising, So poetry's being dissed, and we got to figure out why, but I think it probably starts more in K through 12, so.
You think it's becoming a lost art?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the definition of poetry is expanding, with spoken word. I think there are people who are drawn in more now than, just reading academic poets. I think spoken word has become a medium that's accessible for people. And, there are the Instagram poets and all of that. And no matter what we may think of it, it is popular. And
it surprises me when, handling some of our social media accounts, when you put in hashtag Instagram poet or hashtag TikTok poet, tons of other poems come up. So I do know people are using it. And they are using poetry. They are using social media. Maybe the younger poets, which we're always looking for, maybe that's their medium. They're not going for publishing. They're not going for the New Yorker or the Atlantic. They're doing it on social media. And you can't say it's wrong. It's just different.
Well, that's part of the evolution of just about anything. I mean, to properly teach poetry to students is to teach them not to be intimidated by it. A lot of them come to the classroom with this idea that poetry is hard and you can't understand it. And, if somebody's thrust upon them The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot and said, here, tell me what this is about, and no one can. I don't even think Eliot could tell us really what it was about. But if you preface poetry to students and tell them that they're not going to like every poet that they read or every poem that they read, they loosen up a little bit. It's the same thing with Shakespeare's plays. They foist upon them Julius Caesar in a printed form and say, here, read this. And then they grow up going, God, I hate Shakespeare. But if they see it performed as it was intended, or they're introduced to poetry through music, or they're introduced to poetry through, slam competitions and things like that, they actually don't know that they love poetry until you make them realize they do. So I think you're right about that evolutionary idea of what poetry is and how it's defined.
Plus, the delivery of it is changing. It's not just in books anymore. It's, like you say, spoken word events and that sort of thing that have a much greater, it would seem, immediacy to it.
Yeah, and if you go to TikTok and you see these young people doing their live spoken word, which is poetry, and now I don't have to read it. I mean, I'm just saying it's not wrong. It's just different. I can go to TikTok and see Sierra Jones, just beautiful gold pieces coming out of her mouth. It's poems. It is spoken word, but it's what I guess it's what the youngins are doing today. And again,
Well, and those kind of performances too, when they're not videotaped or not, taped, they're ephemeral. They only exist at that moment, and you tell
Yeah.
people, "Wow, you missed it." It's like concerts used to be when, in back in the day, or stage plays. You lived it that one time, and that was it. And some of these slam competitions, they're not all recorded for posterity.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, "Wow, you should have been there. It was great."
and it happened.
Yes.
And the demands, I think, of spoken word are different than the demands of poetry on the page. As a poet who writes on the page primarily, I pay a lot of attention to form, to line breaks, stanza breaks, all that kind of stuff, that I was trained to look for, and to condensation, trying to condense, to use as few words as possible. Whereas in spoken word, it's stream of consciousness often, and the rules are different. But there are rules, I think, and I think it is a legitimate form.
Well, that's another thing I was talking to Adrian about. He was telling me that a good poet has a sniffer, has a good nose for what is good poetry and what is bad poetry. And I just sat there listening to him, and naturally over the weekend I Googled what's bad poetry. I really wanted to know what is considered good, what is considered bad. And this is poems on paper, not necessarily spoken word. Do you have a definition?
Oh gosh. I like poems, and this is just my personal aesthetic. I think it's not so much good or bad. I don't like to make those kinds of judgment calls. I think it's more what's in line with my aesthetic. And I do pay attention to my ear as I'm writing. I like to be able to hear the language out loud, which is one of the reasons I appreciate spoken word, because when I'm writing, I read it out loud to myself, because I care about how it sounds. And I think that that's an important aspect. I also like poetry that uses unusual imagery, or something that I can visualize in my mind as I'm reading, or something that I can feel in a tactile way, as I'm reading the poem. I like those kinds of poems. And I also like first person poems where poets are honest, about their experiences, as opposed to just writing in abstractions.
Well, in that vein, you include quotes from Yoko Ono throughout your book. What's the connection? Why did you do that?
Well, I saw that little poem of hers, and at the time I was working on this book, and I thought, I need some kind of section break, because I had decided that I was going to break it up into seasonal sections, because that's very much a Japanese thing to do. And, I'm riffing off Hokusai, so I thought I would work in that vein. And I saw that little poem and I thought, this works.
And it certainly breaks it into seasons. And not only that, but for those of you that are not as familiar, Shibori Blue, 36 Views of the Peak, is written by Beth Copeland. And of course, you can get it where, Robert?
You can get it at redhawkpublications.com.
Yay!
And we just had her just sign about a dozen copies. So if you order today, you can get a signed autographed copy.
And what's really cool about this book, and that's probably why I gravitated to it so quickly, Beth, because it does have Fujisan in the background, but it's actually the peak. And the peak is a mountain because Beth lives in Ashe County in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and from her backyard, she can see the peak, which is the highest point in Ashe County. So she's been taking a collection of photos just with her phone. And this particular collection, which makes it so beautiful, is not only do you have a Tanka style poem, which Beth will discuss in a moment, but it's accompanied by her photography, which is quite beautiful. So
Thank you.
it's a slim collection, and it's very specialized, very stylized. And I like the fact that it is divided into seasons, and that, again, a Japanese device.
And folks, this is unlike any collection we've done. This is in and of itself something that's brand new. It's got beautiful photography and beautiful color, but it's one of those books that it's a little bit more expensive in the retail end because of the fact that it's in color. But without those photographs, I don't think it's got the 1-2 punch.
No.
So this is something new for us that we've done. So thank you, Beth, for bringing us this.
Thank you for publishing.
To me, it's just a piece of art. In addition to, poetry being art, but the photography, but the way it's packaged and knowing that it's got the Tanka structure, to me, it's incredibly special. And it does, for those of you that are familiar with Hokusai, the Japanese artist in the early 19th century, and you think you don't know him, but you do. You've seen that iconic, the wave, and the teeny little Fujisan in the background. He was an iconic Japanese artist and woodcutter. And so tell us a little bit about what Tanka is, for those that might not know, and then how you kind of stylized this after Hokusai.
Okay. Tanka is a Japanese form that is similar to haiku. I think everybody knows haiku with the 5-7-5 syllable count. But Tanka has 2 extra lines of 7 syllables each. So it gives the poet a little more room to express ideas and feelings. And that was useful for me because I think a haiku would have been a little too short to really get where I wanted to go with these poems. And in terms of how this project started, when I moved to the mountains in 2019, I just started taking pictures of the peak. And that name, the peak, I wish it had a more poetic name. And often I will tell people, oh, it's the peak. And they say, well, but what's its name? But its name is the peak.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then somebody says it's named after antifreeze.
Hey, I haven't heard that one before. I like that. But, the view that I see is one where it does have this resemblance to Fuji because it has a little dimple at the top. And from a distance, it almost looks like a crater. But of course, it's not a live volcano like Fujisan. So I started taking the pictures at different times of the day, and I was just sharing them with friends on Facebook. I'm not a photographer, really. I mean, I don't have any training. I've never taken a photography class. I was using my iPhone. But it's hard to get a bad picture of that mountain, because it is such a beautiful mountain that even with my mediocre skills, I'm somebody who's often had my thumb in the picture. I still came away with some really gorgeous photographs. And so people on Facebook would occasionally say, your mountain looks like Mount Fuji. And so it wasn't just me who saw the resemblance. And then I had a friend who I knew when I was in grad school at Bowling Green, and he's a friend on Facebook, and he said to me, you should write 36 poems about the peak just as Hokusai wrote and published a folio of 36 prints of Fuji. And so I can't take credit for this idea. It was Mark's idea.
Mark Berman.
Mark
I saw
Berman,
that.
yes.
He wrote a wonderful blurb for you, and it seemed like he had done his work too, so he knew what he was talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
But he didn't know that you had a history with Japan.
I don't think so. I don't think that ever came up when we were, friends in school. And he just, came up with this brilliant idea. And I thought, oh, I like that idea. And so I ran with it and started, selecting 36 poems, which was 36 photos, which was a pretty hard process because there were a lot that I liked. And then I wrote the Tanka to go with the photographs.
I'll tell you, one of the things I did this weekend was I actually went on Google and I looked at the 36 views from Hokusai because I wanted to see it once again, knowing a little bit more, because I learned through your book more to appreciate Fuji and Hokusai a little bit more. So I went back to all 36 plates, and sure enough, Fuji's in the background. It might be tiny,
Yeah.
but Fuji's there. There might be a huge wave in front of it, but Fuji's in the background in all 36. So you did a wonderful job. And again, it's a piece of art.
Thank you. Hokusai went on to publish 100 views of Mount Fuji, so he didn't stop at 36. I don't know if I will do that or not, but
Well, at least that gives you something to do.
yes.
You can,
I think his plan was to get to 110
Yeah,
when he got to 110 years old.
right. He thought at age 70, he still didn't feel that he had reached his peak yet. And I'm in my early 70s. So I felt this connection, with Hokusai and this sense of, being older, but still being productive is important to me too.
Yes, his goal was to do 110 by the time he turned 110, but I think he only got to age
He got
88?
88.
88, yeah.
Yeah.
So he's a little short, but you still have time. You look youthful. Let's get that goal, 110.
I don't think I want to go that long, but I'd like to live to be 88. That would be, I'd like that.
and what about the title Shibori Blue? When I Googled the word Shibori Blue, I got all kinds of interesting returns that have like bowls and glassware and stuff like that that's got that kind of blue. Is it because the way the sky cooperated with you in each one of these photographs?
Well, the title Shibori Blue came from the photograph that's on the cover. And, the sky is very blue. It has those white puffy clouds, and it reminded me of tie-dyeing. And the word shibori refers to a very intricate Japanese tie-dyeing technique. And so that's where it came from. And I just like the sound of that word,
Yeah, pronounce
It's
it correctly for us again.
Shibori.
Shibori. I can't.
You don't, in Japanese, you don't really say an R, so it sounds more like a D, shibori.
Okay.
And it's, just a beautiful word. I liked the sound of it, and it seemed to fit with how I was trying to tie together Japanese sensibilities with my own Western, culture.
Well, like I say, it's simply magnificent. And how long would you say it took you to complete the poems that go with the photos? Because I'm going to say probably the photos came first. And
Yes.
then Mark gave you the idea, you kind of ran with it. So how long did it take you to do the 36?
It took about a year.
Okay.
Or maybe less. I don't remember, but it was the easiest book I've ever written. The poems just kind of fell into place. I'd be walking my dog, and I'd start, the syllables would just kind of pop into my head, and whatever I was seeing would come onto the page later.
Well, I will say, kind of following up with Robert said, we haven't done anything quite like this before. It is very aesthetically beautiful. And when we put this pod up, naturally you'll be hearing it, but I sometimes, of course, put them up on YouTube and I include some of the photos. I will be sharing what I'm looking at when you see the photos with the very stylized Tanka poem on the bottom. It's just, again, a very beautiful piece of work, so thank you.
Thank you.
Is there one you'd like to read for the audience?
Sure, I could read. I've got my book,
Okay.
which
I'm sure they would love to hear an example of it and then rush right over to the website, redhawkpublications.com, and buy the book.
Well, here's one that's a spring poem. Blue stratus clouds resemble a mountain range seen from a distance. The mirrored eye, a mirage. We see rivers in the rain.
That's marvelous.
Really, yeah,
There really
that's
is more room to work in that than there is a
Yeah.
haiku in there, but it's
Yeah.
still got that rhythmic kind of syllable count to it. It's great.
Yeah, tankas are fun to write. I mean, or I should say tanka. You don't put the tanka are fun to write. In Japanese, it's there is no, you don't say tankas, you just say tanka, singular, for both singular and plural.
What is the structure of Tanka? So we know what haiku is, 575. What are the syllables?
It's 57577.
That's cool.
And
Sounds like a phone number from the 1960s.
I
Just trying to, something to help you remember. It's like whenever you say Tonka, I think about those trucks I used to have when I was a little kid.
yeah,
The big metal dump trucks and things like that that help you remember the style of poetry.
well, you could write a tanka about a tanka,
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, I think tanka allows for a little bit more of an emotional response. Haiku tend to be very much using your five senses, and the writers often don't get into expressions of feeling as much as they do with tanka.
Yeah, because you've got the two extra lines. And if
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken, I think you either wrote this in your preface or maybe I read it somewhere else. But typically with Tanka, the first 3 lines describe a season,
Right.
right? And then the last 2 lines, your emotional connection to it.
That's your commentary,
Right.
really. And my tanka are, American tanka. So I'm sure they probably don't follow the rules of Japanese tanka, to a T. But, I hope that I capture the sensibility of the form.
Great. Well, I would say that this would be a book that anyone would want to get, even for someone who may not value or appreciate poetry, because this is art. And if you live in North Carolina, if you live in the mountains and you appreciate mountains, this would be the perfect gift. I really think so.
I think it's marvelous how we can combine through a work of art like this the idea of, mountain living, and then you're combining it with the Japanese culture, you're combining it with, the poet's life. You've lived in different places, were raised in different places and cultures that have entirely different ways of seeing things than oftentimes American culture does. So this thing represents kind of like a synthesis of all of that. And I think that's another thing that contributes to it being unlike anything we've ever done before. So thank you for giving us an opportunity to do that.
Thank you. That particular aspect of the project was something that made it so special for me, was to somehow come full circle with where I am now, living in the Appalachians, which is also part of my heritage. My father grew up in West Virginia and, was very much, the mountain culture was also something that I was raised with in terms of mountain values and so on. And so when I landed up in the mountains, I felt like it was a homecoming, like I had finally found the place where I belong. But, Japan is also special to me. And so to be able to bring those two together was very fulfilling for me as a person.
I think that's one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand about art being represented by the artist is, the art gives us this representation of the artist. And what this book has done is it gives us both the mountains and it gives us your raising and growing up in the Japanese culture. And I think that's something that people, once they realize that, they'll rush to this product and say, I've got to see how that synthesis works. That's terrific.
I hope so. And you know, there are many Western artists who have riffed off of Hokusai, you know, Liechtenstein, others who have used Hokusai as inspiration. So I'm certainly not the first. And I know I won't be the last to do it. And it's, you know, it's a rewarding experience.
There's a beautiful poem that you put in your preface about of two mountains and two minds. Could I ask you to read that?
Oh, sure.
And this kind of ties into what you were saying, Robert, the universality of it all. You know, the mountains, two mountains, the one in Japan, the one here, universal, so many different things that are really just, we're all one, aren't we?
Yeah, tied to the earth. Tied to the earth, because the earth calls us to where we ought to be. And you say the mountains, you figured out that's exactly where you ought to be. And the earth calls to us where we should, you know, spend our lives and our time. So
Yeah, I've told my sister once the mountains are in our DNA, and I believe that. And, you know, Fujisan is also in my memory.
Yeah.
So, of two mountains and two minds, this morning's view of the peak is clearly defined, outlined in light, as if each tree and leaf is sketched in silver point. Sometimes it's wrapped in fog or smoke, like Monet's paintings of Mount Colsas in winter. A white oak stands in the west where the sun sets fire to black earth, where deer visit at dawn and late afternoon, standing silently at the edge of the driveway, as if it's a river they're afraid to step into. Then, as soon as they see my figure in the doorway, they leap across gravel into the woods. A painting of Fujisan on an unfurled fan hangs over the white brocade couch in my house, a twin to the Blue Ridge crest. The mountain indoors mirrors the one outside, both conical from a distance, formed by tectonic forces millions of years ago. Fujisan resonates with the sound of a bronze gong. Basho wandered along its winding paths and wrote of the mountain's wind, fire, and snow. Pilgrims pray at Shinto shrines with stone lanterns and climb past cryptomeria trees to the lotus bud crater. If nirvana is an empty plain, I don't want to go there. I'd rather contemplate two mountains, the inner and outer summits, connecting us to the clouds and the spirits of ancestors.
oh, that's marvelous.
It really is.
Thank you.
That's a great note to end on right there.
I know. When I read this the other day, I just kind of got goosebumps because, again, it's one of those things where having been to Fuji and having been to the mountains, it just meant a lot to me. So thank you, Beth.
Oh, thank you, Patty. It's, you know, wonderful to hear that.
No problem at all. Well, I think we're kind of wrapping this up, except I know Robert has one more question for Beth.
I do. Oh, yes. What am I supposed to say?
Red.
Oh, can you say for us RedPubPod?
Say what?
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
Yes, that's the name of what we're doing right now, the show we're doing, RedPubPod.
RedPubPod. That's kind of a tongue twister.
Yes.
That's why we like to ask people to say that.
See, and then Richard cuts it out and does all kinds of things that will embarrass you later.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but it's funny. I already know what he's going to do.
I just use it out of context. May not be the first time you've been quoted in that way.
No, probably not.
Thank you, Beth, so much for coming down from the mountains to visit us here in Hickory. It means a lot to us.
Yes, it does.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And thank you out there in podcast land for downloading and listening to RedPubPod. We are available at all the places you can get your podcasts. And go to redhawkpublications.com to view our catalog and take advantage of our books. And just join us next time for Patty Thompson and Richard Eller. This is RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
Oh, that was awful.
RedPubPod.
You sound drunk and it's supposed to be early in the morning.
I'll use that.
Come see us again.
Thank you.
You've been listening to
Say what?
RedPubPod.
Red Pub Pod.
A podcast
Red Pub Pod.
from RedHawk Publications.
Red Pub.
Oh, that was awful.
Red Pub Pod.